It's This Week in Creationism, episode number 26. I'm your host, Joel Duff, and here we take a look at the storylines from creationism from this past week. And this week we have, has the Rosetta Stone of human ancestry been found? Dinosaur footprints found in flood rocks? Bent rock layers, once again, and Adam, Eve, and genetics. That and more coming up. Well, I'm back. It's been 10 days since my last update for This Week in Creationism. And the reason for that is I've been gone to the Southwest and have been doing a lot of traveling during my spring break. I've taken a lot of photographs of various different rocks and other plants. And I hope to make that into a couple different stories that I'll share with you at some future date on this channel. But here we're ready to talk about the different headlines that have, or things that have happened in creationism over the time that I've missed. We're just going to start out with, I don't necessarily want to call it the big headline, but it is probably the thing that people have noticed the most if you follow creationism at all. And that is Answers in Genesis. Specifically, Ken Ham has been pushing very hard, pushing heavily a new book that they've published. And that book is by Nathaniel Jeanson, Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson, who is the resident PhD biologist that Ken Ham employs. And he has a new book out that follows up on replacing Darwin from a few years back. And this one's called Traced. And we talked about it before on this channel as something that was coming up soon. And now it is out. And yes, I do have my copy right here. Have not completely read it yet. I've skimmed through good portions of it. What shall I say about this? I'm going to have quite a bit to say about this book. Now, I'm more interested in the book with respect to its sort of sociological influence within creationism versus the science that's contained in here. Or really, I should say there isn't a lot of science contained in this book. That was the one thing I was a little disappointed in, is that this is very much a general consumption, sort of a popular level laying out the implications of some of the things that Nathaniel Jeanson has written in the Answers Research Journal. And so there's really nothing new in the book, despite everything that's been said about it being groundbreaking, and the new Rosetta Stone has been found, and lots of dramatic language used to describe this particular book and the importance of it. I will say that from the perspective of those who are young Earth creationists who aren't familiar with Jeanson's work through the scholarly literature, the young Earth scholarly literature, this will feel like new stuff, all right? And it'll feel like new revelations to most of the readers here. So this is really pushing stuff that's been kind of in the background, and now they're bringing it to the foreground and making a bigger deal out of it. From somebody who's already followed most of that work and read all of it, his previous work, it was kind of a letdown in terms of what I've seen in the book so far in terms of anything new to talk about. Is there anything new to learn from the book? Not really. I felt compelled to buy it, and I'm feeling a little disappointed that I spent the money. But nonetheless, let's talk about the importance of this particular book within the realm of young Earth creationism, not the actual content of the book itself. And Ken Ham, like I said, and Nathaniel Jeanson himself have already written several sort of promotional items for this. They've made several very snazzy videos. Nathaniel Jeanson's done several different YouTube videos and interviews talking about and promoting this particular book. Let's get a little flavor for just how this book is promoted. Ken Ham from Answers in Genesis, he's declared this is a monumental work that has found the Rosetta Stone of human history, right? Jeanson's found the thing that can be used to interpret all of human history. and to understand the physical human history. So Dr. Jeanson deciphers human genetics and has convincingly confirmed the history recorded in the Bible, beginning in Genesis. And there's going to be a big push that by using science first and discovering the human genetic patterns, all right, of changes in the Y chromosome over time, that when you map that using the right interpretive principles, all right, the right scientific principles, it pushes everything back just to 4,500 years ago versus the secular literature, which says that the same Y chromosome evidence points to a common ancestor or Adam for the Y chromosome of about 200 and some thousand years ago. And Ken Ham is convinced that Nathaniel Jeanson has found a way to reinterpret that data, or in Jeanson's mind, better interpret that data in order to discover this 4,500-year chronology. And as a result, can place everyone who's alive today on a family tree, which traces itself back 4,500 years ago to the three sons of Noah. All right, so the book then, essentially the book is starting with the assumption that he can do that, and then explaining all the different lineages of the Y chromosome. It's not actually going to go into the science of how the Y chromosome was, how he did this. He's just going to refer to his previous publications for that. So if you thought you were going to learn like the methodology for how to reinterpret the scientific evidence from genomes and convert that through some sort of filter that allows you to interpret the data within a 4,500-year context, you're not really going to learn that from this book. You're just going to be sent back to previous literature to attempt to figure out his way of dealing with the scientific data. This is more of a popular exploration of the significance of a 4,500-year chronology for all the Y chromosomes among all living people, excluding those things like Neanderthals, which aren't mentioned in the book. The word is used, but aren't discussed. So Ham added, this brilliant scientist has made startling discoveries about who we are, where we come from, and what happened to our ancestors that are truly stunning. We encourage the entire evolutionary community to study Dr. Jeanson's remarkable groundbreaking findings in human history. Well, as I just said, I think an evolutionary biologist who picks this book up and reads it is not going to discover and be able to understand Dr. Jeanson's groundbreaking findings, because although he says a lot of things are groundbreaking, he doesn't have a lot of support in this, although there's a semi-technical section at the end that tries to explain some of the methods, but most of those even refer to previous articles. Now, to be fair, I think Ham is saying that other secular scientists need to look at the whole body of Dr. Jeanson's work, not just this book. All right, so this is the best thing ever for young Earth creationists, because now it gives them the ability to trace all human history and place it within a short time frame. Is he able to do it? We'll leave that till later. There's going to be a lot of discussion about his methodology and the root assumptions he makes, for which everything in this book is, the conclusions of this book are all based upon a set of assumptions that we'll have to explore at a later time. Right? That's not what This Week in Creationism is for. So we're more interested in the broad patterns, like what's going on in creationism, how is creationism being promoted, and what are the trends that are occurring within creationism. And certainly this book plays a role in the overall trends of creationism, because this Ken Ham and Nathaniel Jeanson is trying to promote this book as something that all other creationists is sort of kind of like get behind and be able to say, like, here's our framework, right? Jeanson even goes even farther. He's saying that we're ahead of the evolutionary biologists. We're ahead of the rest of the scientific community because we have a better way of explaining human history, and they need to catch up with us. And so that's a pretty bold claim. And with such bold claims, you expect that if that's true, other creationists should see that truth and should be like trying to like attach themselves to this particular, I'll call it model or hypothesis that's put forward in this particular book. But that's not what I see yet. And, maybe it'll take some time. But this is giving me a big flashback to Replacing Darwin, because in Replacing Darwin, we talked about the same thing. If in order to say that it's revolutionary, that you've replaced Darwin with a better model, you have to at least get other young Earth creationists to climb on board with you and agree with you and say that, yes, your work is excellent, top-notch, and the thing that everyone else should be looking up to. And I want to see that happen for Traced. I mean, one of the things I noticed, if you just thinking from a just the perspective of when I pick up a book and I want to get an idea of how seriously I should take the book, right? One of the reasons you get endorsements is because you want people to endorse the book that maybe somebody will look at and will say, oh, I trust that person. That person says that this is really good stuff. And you should read this too, because you should be interested in this topic and you should trust this particular source. So when I look at that, I see, of course, the endorsement by Ken Ham. Well, Ken Ham's certainly not a geneticist. I've seen Ken Ham talk to Nathaniel Jeanson many, many times on this topic, and Ken Ham doesn't understand anything about haplotypes, Y chromosomes, DNA sequences. He's just kind of starry-eyed, right, when he talks to him. And understandably, he doesn't have any background in this at all. He simply has a Harvard biologist who he, believes and trusts, implicitly, I guess, that he is accurately portraying the evidence and is really made truly revolutionary findings, because Ken Ham can't read his book and can't really read, specifically, he really can't read his literature from the Answers Research Journal and understand the arguments that Jeanson's making from a scientific perspective. And so his endorsement doesn't really tell you anything about the quality of the argument itself, other than the fact that he likes the conclusions. That's really what it's telling you. Like, I approve of the conclusions, right, that Nathaniel Jeanson has come to, because his conclusions very much fit our beliefs, right? They very much fit our perspective on the history of the human race, and it checks all the boxes in terms of like all these things we require our employees to believe. All these things he says in the book completely are in sync with our statement of faith. Right? So he can very much endorse the book because it's saying what he wants it to say. And it's his employee that has come up with it. So that's not really going to tell you anything about, how much you should place your faith in the text itself, Ken Ham's endorsement. So then I look and say, I already have it up. I've got it up here. Don't have to hold it up. All right, so we've got Ken Ham. We've got Stephen Woodworth, who's a professor of history. We have... Who else do we have? We have Joe Owen, who's director of Answers in Genesis in Latin America, who, again, not a scientist, says Jeanson will take you a tour of history unlike anything you've never seen before. I'll agree with that statement. This was a tour of history like nothing else you've ever seen before in terms of the types of conclusions he comes to. And I don't just mean that obviously I know the history that would be expected from a literal reading of Genesis, but he adds a whole bunch of things about the specific history of different people groups that he thinks he's discovered through the Y chromosome studies. Those things I found sometimes very surprising. But nonetheless, remember, he's really referring to the conclusions that Jeanson's coming to. That's what he finds fascinating. Then we have Simon Turpin, who's the executive director for Answers in Genesis in the UK and Europe. All right, again, not a geneticist. Says this will be valuable resource, answering questions that are answered in history books. And then you have somebody like Lee Bruce, who's a retired research specialist, but in linguistics, right? So we go on down the line and we find that there aren't any biologists. Well, there is one biologist, and I've got to dig that up in the book. Oh, it's on the back cover. Ola Hosger from Sweden, professor of mathematical studies. But does do something with a little bit of genetics in terms of statistics. And so what's missing here, right? There isn't an endorsement from a bona fide geneticist. And at the very root of all the conclusions that genes comes from, it's population genetics, right? This is an analysis of DNA sequences to try to understand ancestry. And no one who endorses the book has really a clue how to do that. And so they can't assess the root, the core of his model. All right? The core of his proposal is based on genetic analyses. Now, since this is a popular book, and they're not trying to sell this book to anybody outside of young Earth creationism, really. I mean, despite what Cunningham says about how evolutionary biologists should be like fawning over Nathaniel Jeanson's work because they could discover great things that they've never seen before because his scientist has come up with new discoveries. Despite that, this book isn't at all being sold for those eyes, right? This is for a younger Earth audience. And so it's Cunningham's endorsement that is the crucial one in terms of actually selling the book. All right, to anybody who is actually interested in buying the book. I'm the rare individual that is not prone to think that the analysis of the book is very good, but is still willing to pick up the book and read it. So the book is definitely not written for me. All right, so I have a real problem with the lack of support from the rest of the young Earth creationist community for the essential thesis that's being presented in this book. Like, where is Dr. Rob Carter, who himself is not really a geneticist in the sense of his training being in the area that would be able to assess this work well. Now, at the same time I say that, I find it interesting that Nathaniel Jeanson's work is in many ways based on Carter's work. And yet Jeanson doesn't actually cite, there's no endorsement by Carter on here. So Carter's at Creation Ministries International. And he's done a fair amount of work with Y chromosome and the mitochondrial chromosome, published a couple of papers. Let me move forward here. So here's Robert Carter in 2018, an overview of the independent histories of human Y chromosome and the human mitochondrial chromosome. So Carter, Lee, and then Sanford, who does know a little bit about genetics, right? They wrote an article which then looked at the human Y chromosome. And when you read this article from 2018, what you'll find is I see an awful lot of the conclusions not so easily read by the general public, but you can see almost all the conclusions have traced, all right? All the claims in this book, a lot of them are found in this particular paper. Now, not about each individual lineage. Or what Jeanson does is he goes through each of the different Y chromosome lineages and looks at, like, what happened to the Mongols and Native Americans and all these things. They don't do that in here. But in terms of the big picture of, like, how do you take human Y chromosome data and how might you massage that data into interpreting it within a 4,500 year chronology? That work is done here, and the pros and cons of that data are discussed in this particular paper. So I think this is a really important paper because it provides very much the foundation for this. And I'm a little surprised that I don't see Carter, endorse. This would be, like, to me, the most important endorsement, to get Robert Carter from CMI to endorse Nathaniel Jeanson's book. Now, in creationism, it's a weird world, right? Because you have these parachurch organizations, Answers in Genesis, Institute for Creation Research, Christian Ministries International. And these organizations are not necessarily all that friendly toward each other. I mean, they all have essentially the same core beliefs, right? The foundational assumptions that they hold in terms of their biblical convictions are almost identical to one another. They have somewhat different approaches to how they utilize science and the methodology, or the I guess you could say the apologetic method that they use for communicating with their audience. And there's a lot of talk about them trying to be more unified and present a unified front. But at the end of the day, they are producing their own literature, giving their own talks, writing their own books, right? And the money that they make from each one of those and the donations they get to their organization run their organization, right? They're dependent on donors and on their literature sales. And so a book like this, if Robert Carter were to endorse it, essentially it's an endorsement for a book being published by Master Books, which is just a subsidiary basically of Answers in Genesis, their publishing arm. Then it's just making money for Answers in Genesis. And although you want to be altruistic at some point, it's very difficult to sort of help the other side all the time. Now, in the acknowledgments way at the end, all right, let's see here. Yeah, the acknowledgments at the very end and not at the beginning. He says, I cannot overstate the contribution of Robert Carter at Creation Ministries International. He and I have spent countless hours on the phone and in person, crunching numbers, bouncing research ideas off of one another, and provoking each other to new hypotheses and pursuits. I have learned much from these interactions. That's great. I do believe he did spend a lot of time with Robert Carter. I'm a little mystified by his lack of, he acknowledges them here on page 243. But then when I flip to the references a few pages earlier, and I look at the references, which is a pretty light section really, I don't see Carter. I don't see this paper. To me, this paper is really important. I see 2 pages later, 3 pages later, I see Jeanson. All right, I see all of Jeanson's work, which is not that dissimilar to this work, and much of Jeanson's latest paper in 2019 is kind of a recapitulation of this 2018 paper by Carter and Sanford. So I would consider this particular article more foundational for some of the stuff that ends up in this book. And so I just don't understand why young earth creationists can't maybe work with each other a little bit better. And it makes me wonder, will Carter actually endorse this book anyway? Will he write a review that is very positive? Because without somebody coming along and saying, yes, I have looked at Nathaniel Jeanson's underlying mathematical analysis, right? The way he tries to interpret the mutation rates, the way he's developing his Y chromosome phylogeny, how he statistically approaches where the breakpoints are. Like, how is he going to find, because he's going to claim in the book that he's found the breakpoint between the 3 sons of Noah. And I look at that phylogeny, and I'm a systematist, so I do phylogenies, right? And I look at it like I would not have any confidence in that. And I can't find any statistical confidence interval that he has presented anywhere, but I'm still searching. Maybe I overlooked it when I skimmed some article for the 3rd time. And so I want another young earth creationist who at least has some knowledge of genetics to say to me and to others outside of young earth creationism, I've examined his underlying work, right? His underlying research, and I find it to be solid, right? I think that the data works, and I think that he's come to the best conclusions that can be come to. And I think that his inferences in his book are very reasonable. I don't think that's unreasonable to ask, that another young earth creationist would say that outside of Answers in Genesis, right? Because when you look at the acknowledgments and then you look at the endorsements, what are most of them from? Other people at Answers in Genesis. In other words, within your own small enclave, you've gotten other people to read the book and say, everyone else should buy this book. I'll just say, why should others take the book seriously as you think it should be taken, if you can't get other young earth creationists to take it seriously, right? And they have to be somebody who knows something, right? There's going to be other young earth creationists who will just like fall down and bow down to this book. I mean, I know a couple, right, who are going to think it's the best thing since sliced bread, and they're going to believe every single word. But they have no idea how to analyze the data. They have no idea how to assess the work that Nathaniel Jeanson's done, so they can't actually assess whether it's accurate. They simply like the results. And so therefore, they trust it and believe it. And Ken Ham said so, and so it's fine. But as I said, if you want other scientists to take it seriously, you have to find another geneticist to say this is really good work. Carter, I'm not sure is a great geneticist, but at least that would be a start. What about Purdom? Now, she's within, Georgia Purdom is a molecular geneticist. She has a PhD from Ohio State University. She's done nothing in genetics, really, at Answers in Genesis since taking the job there. And so she hasn't worked in that field since getting her PhD. And her particular area of work wouldn't really be in population genetics. So even she would not, I doubt that she can read Nathaniel Jeanson's papers in the Answers Research Journal and probably doesn't understand them, right? And that's not a slam on Georgia Purdom. This is complicated stuff, and there's only a select number of people who understand that literature well enough to be able to really truly assess it. And so it's going to be pretty hard to find a young earth creationist who has enough background in these types of things to be able to assess it. But at least if Georgia Purdom were to say that she believes this work is excellent, and if she comes out and says, I'm a geneticist and I've examined his data, right? And I've crunched his numbers and analyzed and looked at his assumptions, and I believe all of them to be accurate, that would be a start as well. It would be from their own organization, and it's kind of self-serving, but it's something. And even Georgia Purdom doesn't have a quote on this book, even though they have a geneticist in-house that they could have put on there, and people know Georgia Purdom. I don't know Stephen Woodworth. I don't know Ola Holster, can't read Swedish. I've never heard of them, and I'm pretty well versed in young earth creationism and the world of young earth creationism. So, anyone else who's going to think about buying this book and they're like, oh, well, what has people said about it? They're not going to know who these people are. Whereas if Georgia Purdom was on the back, it'd be like, oh yeah, Georgia Purdom. I've heard her speak before, right? That would be the person you'd want there. So I'm just curious, and maybe somebody could help me. Maybe somebody knows some backstory here. Why, what's the thought process behind who endorses this book? Because I'll tell you what it feels like. This is what it feels like. I don't know if this is true, but this is the way I feel when I look at this. I feel like they couldn't find anyone who actually understands Jeanson's work to actually endorse his work. That's what it feels like. It feels like, hey, we found a historian, a linguist, and so forth. They're a young earth creationist, and he's got some interesting things to say. And by the way, these endorsements are partial phrases with ... a groundbreaking book ... likely to become a classic. I wonder what else this person said. How hard did they have to work to capture 3 or 4 words out of something they might have written about that? And so it's not the best look. Those are not those are not resounding endorsements. So other than Ken Ham, which as I said, is the only endorsement that he really needs, right? Because Ken Ham says to buy it, that's most of the copies you're going to sell anyway. I'm just telling you from the perspective outside of young earth creationism. If you want the book to be taken more seriously, find somebody who has credentials to say, this is worth reading and you should spend your time with it. All right, I've been talking about this for a long time. We'll see where it goes. We'll see what happens. I mean, maybe there's stuff lined up. Maybe there's other young earth creationists who really have delved into this data and can explain it. So it's not just Nathaniel Jeanson who is explaining his work and then being forced to tell us all how wonderful it is, because I actually feel kind of bad for him. He has to like self-promote his own work. It would be nice if other people who really understood his work, but maybe that's the problem. Maybe nobody else really understands it. I mean, Ken Ham does not understand, does not understand how the data was collected and how it was analyzed. He has no idea. And so will Jeanson find anyone else in the young earth creationist community who can come alongside and say, I'm right there with you. This is really great stuff. Because what I'm seeing, and I'm sorry, I am rambling, but I'm on a roll here. I didn't really intend to say a whole lot about this book yet. But for what I'm seeing so far is, I'm seeing the endorsements for this book are far lighter than the endorsements for Replacing Darwin. He managed to get some people outside of Answers in Genesis to endorse Replacing Darwin. This appears to be completely enclosed within Answers in Genesis with a few people around the periphery. They're not big names and they're not geneticists. And so this seems to be the idea of one person, right? This is one person's work. And I also know that it's been heavily criticized. All his previous papers, there are plenty of reasons to think that his assumptions are far off, and therefore the results that he's presenting here are very dubious. And those criticisms have been out there for several years. And the one thing I notice about this book is, as I work through parts of it, is that he doesn't address those criticisms. He basically ignores them. And he removes portions of what I think would be really interesting things to talk about because they don't really fit into his narrative. And so there's some pretty significant holes here. So again, get a young earth creationist who knows some genetics to endorse this book and to tell others that they should read the book. And that it is a good model, not just, oh, this is an interesting hypothesis, and I think it should be taken, I think you should consider it. No, that's not the claim here. That's not what Ken Ham's saying. Ken Ham's saying, this is the Rosetta Stone. Like, this is the answer. Like, this explains human history. We don't need to go any further, and other scientists need to catch up to this wonderful data. If other young earth creationists can't see that, then that casts a lot of doubt upon the relevance and the accuracy of this work. Now, at the end of the day, there may really not be any young earth creationist out there who can actually evaluate this book. And more importantly, evaluate his previous literature. And that's a big problem for young earth creationism. Because what it means is he really doesn't have anybody within the community to critique him. I think Robert Carter has probably done a really good job in terms of like their bouncing back ideas. And I can see Carter's influence in terms of toning him down on a few things from previous publications. But again, why doesn't he give more credit to Carter and include Carter? I mean, I think they should have written the book together. Now that creates a whole royalty problem and all that. But wow, that would be a message if Carter and Jeanson had gotten together, CMI and Answers in Genesis, and actually done something collaborative, right? That would say so much more to the young earth community, and it would project something outside of their young earth creations community that was sorely needed. And that is that they aren't all just a bunch of individuals with completely individual ideas, and that there is no real answers that come from young Earth creationists. Because an answer, right, a really good model for understanding ancestry, population genetics, it should at least find some consensus within the community of people who have a consensus on all the other important things, which are the biblical considerations. Okay, now I'm going to go back and I'm just going to fire things up a little bit more here. I've already gone down this road pretty far, so let's just keep going with it. I don't think it's an accident that Creation Ministries International, on their Facebook page just yesterday, pushed an old article. All right, now they push old articles all the time. But I don't think this is a random generated thing where it's like, oh, this happens to be the article that came up. They pushed out an article, Noah and Genetics, and it's an article by, guess who? Robert Carter from 2010. And in 2010, here is Robert Carter talking about Adam, Eve, Noah, and modern genetics, talking about the Y chromosome, talking about how you can trace ancestry through the Y chromosome, and the mitochondrial DNA. And so it's kind of saying, to me, it's saying, hey, Creation Ministries International has already talked about this idea, and that 2018 paper already considers some of the important features of things like you need a higher mutation rate in order to explain this within 4,500 years. And there's a lot of discussion in that Carter and Sanford paper about mutation rates. And then Jeanson, of course, has to modify the mutation rate or use a mutation rate that then gets all of the Y chromosome variation squished into 4,500 years. And he has a variety of different kind of rescuing methods and other ways of explaining away data that doesn't seem to fit, or the fact that different lineages have different branch lengths and so forth. All that's discussed in Carter and Sanford's paper. And yet, if you go to Answers in Genesis and you read Ken Ham talking about this book and Jeanson's work, it's solely about them. I mean, it doesn't talk about it like it's the community of young Earth creationism. It talks about Jeanson's made these great discoveries. I have this PhD, Harvard PhD, who has made these amazing discoveries. And personally, if I were Carter, I'd be just a little bit offended by the language they're using, because is this book full of discoveries? I don't think so. I just don't think that this is got revolutionary ideas in it. The core ideas, right? In other words, the way that this analysis is sculpted and is really already out there. What this book does is it's much more flamboyant, all right, in its language, and it goes many farther steps than Carter would have. Lots of speculation about like this happened and then this happened and like this people came from there, and I'm going to specifically identify the three sons within the Y chromosomes, as opposed to Carter, who shows a Y chromosome tree and then talks about how at the root of this tree, that's where we'd find the three sons, but doesn't actually say this one is this son, this one, that one. And I think the reason he doesn't say that is because there's no statistical analysis you can do that would clearly delineate three lineages. Because those three lineages are so close together, you can't get a statistical support for that. And so anytime you would say, well, that's that, and that's the third one, is just you eyeballing it. And you're just like guessing. All right. And if you're just guessing, then guess what? The results of this book are guessing. I mean, if at the end of the day you're saying, well, we'll look up your Y chromosome. If you have if you're an R1BL21, which is what I am, then you're a son of Shem. That's guessing, right? I don't see how I can't trace the statistical genetic evidence directly to that. It's like, yes, one of the sons. But which one? Even using he's going to use some biblical stuff to try to say, like, well, from the table of nations, these people lived in these particular regions and they happen to have these Y chromosomes. You still have to, all right, I said I'm going too far with this. I didn't want to get into I didn't want to get into the phylogeny stuff. And I don't have figures here, so I'm just waving my arms at this point. Let's move on. Let's move on. Let's move over to creation, the creation ministries. A bunch of stuff going on at creation.com. And I just picked out a couple things. And one of them is this article that they just published on the website, but comes from 2021 from their magazine, The Firewalkers. Surrounded by fiery lava and waters, animals left their mark. By Jonathan O'Brien, who I had never heard of. Every time I've never heard of an author, I always try to look them up, find out something about them. Here's what's just stated on the Creation Ministries International site. He works in agriculture. He was a laboratory assistant in geological exploration, and he does have a 1990 degree in geoscience, basically like a bachelor's degree. All right, so a little bit of geoscience background. So what's the gist of this paper? He is, in this very short article, he's talking about the Karoo Formation, which is a very large basalt volcanic outcropping in southern Africa. Absolutely enormous outcropping of lava flows. And there's this discovery of a very rare, for this particular location, a very rare set of footprints, right, of some kind of maybe dinosaur, maybe mammalian, right, or maybe both, type of animal footprints that are found in thin layers of sandstone that are between layers of lava. All right, between basalt layers. In southern Africa, you have thousands of cubic kilometers of lava that are laid down. But it's not all laid down at the exact same time. Otherwise, it would just be one giant block of lava, right, of basalt. What you have is you have layers of basalt, and then you have layers of sedimentary material between them, right, suggesting that there is a flow of lava, and then there is some time period in between in which there's some kind of, I'll say it's some kind of erosion occurring, and then you have layers of sediment brought in, sometimes sediment from somewhere else, and then you have another lava flow and so forth. All right, so it appears there's like these stacked layers. Now, this is all old stuff, and so for young Earth creationists, this all had to happen during the flood. All right, this is all dated to 100 million years ago, so this had to be sometime during the flood year. And since it happened in the flood year and you found footprints, these have to be footprints that were laid down by animals that were alive during the flood. Now, of course, there are billions of footprints in rock layers that young Earth creationists claim are flood layers. I think that's a huge problem for young Earth creationism, for flood geology. They explain that as animals, the world is basically, the world has water sloshing around on it, as sort of tsunami waves go across the land. And of course that kills lots of animals, but some of them survive, right? They can swim long enough, and then the wave goes by, and then there's a new layer of sediment laid out, and the animal walks on it, leaving footprints, and then another wave comes by and then covers that up, and that's how the footprints were preserved. Big problems with that model, but nonetheless, that's their idea. And so what about all this basalt? Well, that all had to be formed during the flood too. So this author's envisioning that there's massive volcanoes that are oozing up lava. At the same time, these water waves are coming by. And so the water comes by and maybe helps solidify the new fresh lava, and then sort of throws a layer of sediment on top. And then there's some animals that are they're kind of floating on some maybe vegetation that's floating on the surface. And then the water washes off, the animals jump on board the sand, and then they walk across the sand. And then there's a volcanic explosion, and the lava runs out across the surface of the land and then preserves those footprints, right, until they're eroded after the flood, and now we can see them today. Right? Oh, let me just read a little bit of this article and give you a flavor for like what he's envisioning is happening here. Far from the shore, Parts of the sea were calm. All right, so like Noah's out there in the middle of the ocean and things aren't that bad. But on land, there was a mass confusion, right? God's judgment had sent in a train or a series of processes that resulted in the sea steadily overwhelming the land. This included the release of enormous quantities of water that resided deep within the Earth's crust, increasing the sea's volume. So the sea's rising up, right? As the surge passed, the water level temporarily abated. All right, so surge goes by and then the land reappears, and wide expanses of newly deposited sand came into view. As the surviving animals emerged from the water and moved about, often in panic, they left their tracks in the fresh sediment. All right, then you got, there's this basalt, so now I got to explain that too. Lava. Suddenly, a glowing lava flowed into the area with explosions of steam as it hit channels of water. The situation was desperate. Some animals managed to avoid the lava and could walk out onto the hardened rock that had been sufficiently cooled by incoming streams and water. Soon after, the floodwaters came back, right? The next big wave from the ocean comes and covers over the continent again. The floodwaters come back, flow over the top of the new cooling rock. The water deposited more sand and mud on top of the lava. This sequence of flooding with sediment deposition, followed by lava flows, continues over and over and over again. Dissolved minerals in the floodwaters begin hardening the sand into sandstone. So these minerals in the water are making the sand into sandstone right there in the matter of days or weeks. The molten lava solidifies and cools rapidly into black volcanic rock called basalt. Now, the reason he's talking about there's multiple times this is happening is because there's multiple layers of basalt, but also because there's multiple layers of footprints, right, in different sedimentary layers. And so these animals have to keep on like coming back. The land has to get exposed. They have to walk back on land. The land has to get covered again really quickly to preserve the footprints, because we all know that the only way to preserve footprints is if it has to happen fast. I'm saying that sarcastically because, of course, that's not true. Lots of footprints don't need to be preserved in an instant to be preserved. Okay, here's the paper that inspired this author, tracking these Karoo firewalkers. Track waves of quadrupeds and biped dinosaurs and mammaliforms in the Karoo igneous rock formations. Now, what's his name here? What O'Brien was arguing here is that only the flood could explain these footprints, because how could an animal possibly be exposed? Backtrack. In this paper, they describe how this enormous area of basalt was created by enormous volcanic, not explosions really, oozing lava, right? Can't remember the name of it. Profusing. There's a name for that kind of volcano. It's slipping my mind right now. Lava is pouring out onto the land. And what O'Brien thinks is, he thinks in an evolutionary model, or a model of an ancient Earth, that you'd had this time where you have all this lava form that would produce so much heat, so many toxins. Animals couldn't survive them. They wouldn't be walking around the basalt, because here you have this layer of sandstone. And then right above it, you have basalt, and right below it, you have basalt. And that must have formed quickly, because no animals would have survived that situation if that had happened long ago in the past. And this was all happening. It had to have happened all really fast. I don't know where he's getting this thought from. I mean, has he not looked at Hawaii and seen that people build their houses around lava fields that were lava fields just a few years ago, let's say decades ago? Has he not watched the footage from the Iceland volcano, where there is lava moving and people are 30 feet away just sitting there watching it walk by? In fact, I am sure that people walked over the surface of the Iceland sediments there, and then lava came and rolled over that. And in some ways, there are footprints underneath there that are preserved, right? You know, those are human footprints right there. Didn't take a global flood to do that, right? That's just natural. Those are things that are happening in the world right now. There are 1 million people living around Mount Rainier out in Washington. And the thing he doesn't really understand is that this event in the Crew Formation spans like 20 million years, right? So during 20 million years, there's an enormous amount of lava. This is an event. These are events over those years that the spewing of that is thought to have affected the entire global climate. There's that much stuff being heat and gases coming out of these volcanoes. But over 20 million years, that could mean 1,000 years of activity, which might have eliminated most of the animals in the area. But then it might mean 5,000 or 10,000 years where nothing's really happening and you have sediments forming, you have rivers there, you have erosion, you have animals coming back and living in the area. And then 1,000 years later, you have another volcano and you have the lava pour out. This is just what you see happening today. There's nothing surprising about it. And his whole article is about how like this couldn't have happened in the past. The only way to explain these footprints is had to have happened instantly, had to have happened by animals that are running around, literally running away from the lava that's occurring in waves successively on, like successive days or something like that. I just don't understand how, I feel like he just couldn't have read this article. I think he probably read the highlight of it, which just really emphasized how there was these huge explosions and these animals lived. Look at the title here, fire walkers, animals that must have lived around volcanoes, and how there was a diversity of animals that lived around volcanoes based on what we're seeing in the fossil record now. It's really not a problem for an ancient Earth. In fact, an ancient Earth easily explains the observations that we're making. And a global flood is an extremely challenging way to try to get around that, try to explain these footprints. Oh, I forgot I had this. For long-age believing scientists, these preserved tracks from when these huge rock deposits were forming are a strange and unusual discovery. Not strange, not unusual. Finding them within a layer of geologically immense event of global significance, yes, the entire 20 million years worth of events was globally significant in the sense that we can see the evidence of their effects on other places on the earth during that same time frame. All right, and the fact that you can see the effects of an event that occurred in South Africa somewhere else in the global rock column because of changes to the climate is in itself independent evidence that you have real events occurring over long periods of time in the past. You wouldn't have that kind of correlation in a global flood occurring just over a few weeks. Is irrefutable evidence that something very strange and indeed bizarre occurred. Irrefutable evidence? No. Animals were surviving for a time at the deep geological formation as the deep geological formation was being deposited. I don't know. If animals could survive all these huge tidal waves and then run out on those sediments, and I don't know how young Earth creationists believe that every single animal was killed during the flood, because it appears that many of them were able to survive for an awful long time. So why not survive the whole flood this way? Yeah, let's move on. Curved rocks. Every young Earth creationist favorite thing to talk about, how there's curvy rocks that undermine millions of years. Have you ever watched a beach, looked up and admired the folded strata, the folded rock layers? There are plenty of examples of folding rocks. And does it undermine millions of years? Not at all. Folded rocks are not an issue, but I only brought this particular article up because of something I saw in the conclusion. The supposed millions of years to bend rock strata into folds is an illusion. There's nothing illusionary about it. It's good physics, all right? Folded strata do not constitute evidence for vast amounts of time in rocks, all right? So those are statements, all right? Presumably supported by other evidence, because it's not really here in this paper. Furthermore, no one has waited for eons to watch if it would really take that long to form folds in the strata. Okay, so now here's the real argument, right? It's like, okay, you've got these models and you have this biochemistry and you can show through physics that if you push on rock for a long period of time with heat, that you eventually conform the bonds of those molecules and you will bend rock. And the thing is that bent rock isn't exactly smooth bent. There's often tiny little fractures in it, but won't go off into all those things. But okay, so you got all that fancy math, physics stuff that suggests it could happen. But we don't think it happens, right? We don't actually think that's, I don't understand why I don't think that's good math and good physics. But nonetheless, it doesn't matter because you haven't actually demonstrated it, right? You haven't actually bent a rock for 1 million years to show you can actually bend it. All right, so this is just a fallback on the were you there argument, right? You haven't redone the experiment in a lab, and since you can't do it, we'll never have to believe it. We'll never have to believe that rocks could bend because you can't actually perform the experiment. Yeah, that's mostly a nonsense argument because there's lots of things that we can't actually repeat in the lab, but for which we can be very confident have occurred or are able to occur just by understanding the physical processes of this world, which we understand quite well in the case of chemistry. Then they back it up. They go even further. All right. Deep time is a philosophical idea derived from uniformitarianism, not a scientific observation. So that's even going further with that same idea. Oh, it's not a scientific observation, deep time, because you weren't around for that long. So how do you know that time existed? This is just a cheap way of concluding an article, which is saying, okay, we're just going to throw out our trump card here. You might come up with some really good explanations for how rock could bend, and it might all sound really convincing, but hey, you can't actually prove it because you can't do it, because you don't have 1 million years to prove it. Those types of arguments, not very convincing. And then finally, let's just flip over to Institute for Creation Research. A whole bunch of standard sort of intelligent design articles and creation by design and so forth. But the thing that's here is intense ice age volcanism fits biblical model. Frank Sherwin here, he talks about how all this volcanism that's observed in the Greenland ice core fits the biblical model because they believe that it was volcanoes that occurred after the flood. Remember, this is ICR, so they believe that only the very top layer of sediment, very, very top layer, is post-flood sediment. But there is evidence of volcanoes that occur, and they can see them in the ice core layers. All right, so in the ice core layers in Greenland, when a massive volcano goes off, ash floats around the whole earth, right, and falls onto the ice cap and is preserved in those layers. And there they would say, oh, well, you can see all these different evidences of volcanoes, and our model says that the ice age was caused by volcanoes because the volcanoes created a cooling effect on the earth, which helped then to cause the ice age that occurred after the biblical flood. All right, I took one look at the reference for this particular paper. And what in this article they talk about the evidence of, and they actually talk about the numbers of volcanoes that are recorded in the Greenland ice cores. But they're only talking about what happened in the last Greenland ice cores in the last like 40,000 to 60,000 years, which of course they would translate into the last 4,000 years. But they don't tell their audience that the ice core goes down 120 to 130,000 years. So they're only talking about the top 1/3 or so of the ice core, and they're saying, oh, there's all this evidence of volcanism in there, and that fits our model because we need volcanism in order to show how the earth cooled. But if you take a look at the entire ice core, which they must think all occurred after the flood, right? First you had to form Greenland. That would have been formed by the flood. And then you would have had the ice deposited on top of Greenland. That had to have been post-flood. And so you're talking about the entire depth, which is a huge amount of ice, covering 130,000 years. Well, when you look at all the volcanism in all 130,000 years, it's an absolutely enormous amount. And it includes some volcanoes that young Earth creationists don't think occurred during the post-flood region. They think it happened during the flood. If you go to the same volcano in some other place in the world. I don't know. Maybe that's not clear. Since the ice cores record the volcanoes, you can go down to the lower layers of the volcanoes, the ice core, and you can pick out some of that ash. And each layer of ash has its own chemical signature because every volcano has a different mix of a molecular mix, right, of chemicals, depending on where the lava what lava comes up and how it interacts with the crust of the earth. And so it's like a fingerprint. Every volcano on the earth today has a signature fingerprint, chemical fingerprint. And so you have that fingerprint analysis in the Greenland ice cores. So if you take one of those volcanic layers, ash layers, from deep down in the ice core, and you ask, what volcano does that match? Like, where was that volcano that went off? You can find some of those volcanoes and say, like, oh, this is that volcano. Well, when the young Earth creationist looks at that particular volcano in its natural context, there in Washington or state or something like that, or Oregon, they look at it and they say, oh, well, that volcano was part of the flood era, except its ash is inside of post-flood ice. Problem there, right? So I don't know if they're just purposely ignoring all those lower ash layers. Besides, it's too many volcanoes. I mean, the world would have just been covered with ash completely, and it would have been a snowball Earth if there had been that many volcanoes going off just during a 100-year period. Because that's what they want to say. They want to say all these volcanoes from the 60,000 years, the top layer of ice in Greenland, that's enough volcanism for us to explain our model. But I'm saying you got to include the whole thing, which includes all the volcanoes that must have all been post-flood. And when you squish all that volcanic activity into a few hundred years, you got a bigger problem. It's going to be more than just a short ice age that occurred. It's going to be a huge problem. And so this is just another example where they're gleaning little bits of data from probably a scientific report, not looking at the original article, or not really telling the audience there's this other evidence that doesn't really fit our model. They're just finding the evidence that fits and presenting it. Wow. Okay. I didn't think I was going to talk this long because I was going to make a shorter This Week in Creationism, but here we are. And let's stop there for this week. I got some other stories saved up for next week that hopefully will be a little bit simpler to explain. That's it for This Week in Creationism. Like I said, I'm working on some talks having to do with some photography that I did in the last week in Arizona. And I've got some other projects in the works, and we'll see when those get done. We'll talk to you later. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.